Hello friends, I invite you to listen to a new story on my Purple Heart Stories channel. Have a good time. Chapter 1, Suspicion. James Mackenzie never figured his life would turn into a trap of lies and double crosses. At 45, he was what you call a pro, a former anti-terrorism squad commander, now head of security at Midtown Plaza shopping mall. His wife, Rachel, a whiz with video surveillance systems, seemed like the perfect match for a guy in his line of work. But fate had a real curveball headed James's way. Rachel's office romance with a new immigrant employee would only be the tip of the iceberg in a sea of impending doom, one that could claim the lives of thousands of innocent people, including the veteran's own daughter from a previous marriage. A gray Monday morning started like any other, with the hollow echo of footsteps down the mall's empty corridors. James was headed for his daily briefing, his heavy boots pounding out a steady rhythm on the glossy floor. 6 security guards were already gathered in the meeting room, his team, the guys he'd trusted his life to more than once. The briefing was short and sweet. Schedule check, post assignments, standard operating procedure. But there was something else hanging in the air, a vague sense of foreboding, like a cold snap on a hot day. That same day, he laid eyes on Rashid for the first time. The new IT department hire looked sharp in his pressed suit. His brown eyes radiated calm, and his smile seemed inviting. "He's a real whiz," the IT department head said, introducing the newbie. James shook his outstretched hand, a firm, confident grip. Who knew that this hand would soon turn his world upside down with one flick of the switch on a bomb? James started hearing alarm bells ringing after about a week. Rashid was spending way too much time in the video surveillance room where Rachel worked. "Checking the systems," he'd say, but his eyes lingered on her longer than necessary. James saw those looks, quick, almost imperceptible, but loaded with that special attention that any guy can spot a mile away. Rachel was playing along. Oh, she was playing along all right, a slight turn of her head, a casual touch, a quiet laugh at some joke. All these little things added up to a picture that James refused to acknowledge. Could there be more to this flirting than met the eye? You betcha there was, because then the late night started. "Got to finish the report. The new system needs some fine-tuning. Sorry, honey, got a ton of work." James heard these excuses, and every word hit him like a bullet in a Kevlar vest. Doesn't kill you, but leaves bruises on your heart and cracks in your ribs. Rachel's phone conversations got quieter. She'd go into another room when the phone rang. She started deleting text messages right after reading them. James noticed this out of the corner of his eye, pretending to be engrossed in the newspaper. 15 years in the anti-terrorism unit had taught him to spot the details. Details he'd rather not see. James couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. Years of service had taught him to act methodically, and now these skills came in handy in his own family drama. He set up a camera in their bedroom, hiding it in an innocuous alarm clock. Started checking the GPS on his wife's phone, thanks to his access to the shopping mall's security systems. Recorded the time she left and returned, compared them with her work schedule. Every night, sitting in his office, he'd review surveillance camera footage, tracking his wife's and Rashid's movements through the shopping mall, looking for overlaps. It was like watching a silent film where every frame caused pain. And then one evening, the security system he had put together delivered an unexpected surprise. Only it wasn't in the direction James had expected. He was reviewing footage from the underground parking garage when he spotted Rashid. He was meeting with a group of Middle Eastern men near an old van. Something about their behavior made the former anti-terrorism commander uneasy, the characteristic gestures, wary glances around, military bearing. They were clearly trying to stay in the camera's blind spots, but years of service had taught James to see what others preferred to hide. He zoomed in on the image, peering at their faces. One of them looked vaguely familiar, like he'd seen him in some old files. And that's when an alarm bell rang in his head. This was no longer just a story about an unfaithful wife. From that point on, James started tracking Rashid. no longer just as a suspected cheater. He installed a bug in his work computer, gained access to surveillance cameras in the area around his house, started a special notebook to record all his contacts and movements. Every step the new IT specialist took was now recorded with military precision, far beyond the workplace. James felt that something more sinister was hidden behind his wife's affair, and his intuition, honed by years of service, screamed of danger. He didn't yet know exactly what that danger was, but he was sure it was real. It was right in the middle of this secret surveillance that Sophia, his 14-year-old daughter from his first marriage, barged into his office. Her eyes were shining with joy. Her class was planning a big field trip to the shopping mall. "Can you believe it, Dad? We're coming right to your work. I told my classmates that it's the safest place on earth because you're keeping an eye on everything," she chirped, waving a permission slip for the field trip. James was signing the paper when his eye caught the date. It matched one of those he'd encountered several times in Rashid's intercepted messages. Something inside him snapped. A coincidence. His own daughter would be in the shopping mall on a day when Rashid was planning something. He no longer believed in coincidences. He had to get to the bottom of his dark intentions ASAP. The first real evidence of the affair came crashing down on him like an avalanche. The camera in the alarm clock went off on Thursday evening. Rachel was getting ready for a corporate party, primping in front of the mirror. James was reviewing the footage in his office, and every move his wife made was like a stab in the heart. A special hairstyle, a new dress, so revealing that he'd never seen it before, special underwear. The phone in her hand vibrated quietly. "I'll be waiting," he read the message from Rashid in the mirror's reflection. Rachel smiled, that special smile that used to be reserved just for him. James stopped the recording. His hands were shaking, but not with rage, with the realization that this wasn't the worst revelation yet. It was time to act decisively. At night, when only the skeleton crew was left in the shopping mall, he broke into Rashid's office. The search was quick and professional. 15 years in the anti-terrorism unit hadn't been for nothing. At first glance, everything looked normal: documents, flash drives, notebooks. But in a hidden pocket of his briefcase, he found them: documents in the name of Karim al-Khazri. A passport, driver's license, some forms. And a photograph in it. Rashid was standing next to a man whose face James had seen in databases on international terrorism. A man everyone thought had died long ago in the Middle East. A man who, according to the dates on the documents, was Rashid's own brother. However, the photo was clearly recent. So this criminal was still alive, and his own brother was cooking up something nasty in the shopping mall where he, James, was responsible for security. At that moment, all the pieces of the puzzle started to come together in a gruesome picture that chilled him to the bone. Chapter 2: Discovery. The night in the security office was a long one. James sat in front of the computer screen, staring at the databases he had from his time in the anti-terrorism unit. The photograph from Rashid's briefcase lay before him, like a piece of a deadly puzzle. His fingers flew across the keyboard, opening file after file until there it was. Karim al-Khazri, Rashid's brother, one of the most dangerous terrorist organizers in the Middle East. Officially, he had died in an airstrike 3 years ago. But the photograph said otherwise. Alive, well, and from the looks of it, planning something terrible here in America. Now everything fell into place. Rashid hadn't just shown up at the shopping mall. He hadn't just seduced his wife. This was a carefully planned operation. Through Rachel, he'd gained access to the security systems. Through her, he'd learned all the weaknesses in the center's defenses. James looked at his wife's photograph on his desk, and his heart clenched with pain and fear. She was just a pawn in someone else's game, unaware that her lover was part of a terrorist cell. But the worst was yet to come. He had to figure out exactly what the brothers were planning. The next day, James used his position as head of security to gain access to Rashid's computer. What he found there sent a chill down his spine. In an encrypted folder were detailed diagrams of the shopping mall, but not the ones that were publicly available. These were engineering plans with notes about the location of generators, ventilation systems, load-bearing structures. Red dots marked the locations where people congregated most at different times of the day. Yellow marked evacuation routes and security posts. And blue marked the ideal points for planting explosive devices. James looked at these marks, and images of past terrorist attacks he'd prevented while working in the anti-terrorism unit flashed before his eyes. That same evening, his patience and professionalism paid off again. Watching Rashid through street surveillance cameras, he noticed him turn into a deserted alley on the outskirts of town. James, who was tailing him in his car, parked in the shadows and took out a professional camera with a powerful zoom. What he saw through the lens confirmed his worst fears. Rashid was meeting with his brother. Karim al-Khazri, whom the whole world thought was dead, was here, in the flesh and blood, and was explaining something heatedly, waving his hands. James couldn't hear their conversation, but the body language was eloquent. They were discussing some plan, and judging by how often Karim pointed to his wristwatch, time played an important role in this plan. After a week of round-the-clock surveillance, James finally got the missing piece of the puzzle. Reviewing another batch of Rashid's intercepted messages, he came across an encrypted email. The code was simple, the same one the terrorists had used 5 years ago in Syria. Operation at the shopping mall scheduled for the 15th. Maximum number of casualties guaranteed by school field trip. Team is ready. James read the message 3 times, feeling the ground slip out from under his feet. The 15th, the day his Sophia would be here with her class. The day his daughter would be in the epicenter of a terrorist attack. The realization of this coincidence took his breath away. The terrorists had chosen the perfect moment to strike. For the first time in his life, James Mackenzie didn't know what to do. Military logic demanded immediate action. Arrest Rashid, wipe that handsome smile he had used to charm Rachel off his face, shake the information out of him, prevent the terrorist attack at the preparation stage. That would be the right thing to do for his family and for security. He could still save his marriage. As long as things hadn't gone beyond flirting and meaningful looks between Rachel and Rashid, as long as his wife hadn't crossed the line. One call to the bureau, and it would all be over right now. But his professional instincts screamed otherwise. Taking Rashid now would mean scaring off the main target, his brother Karim, one of the most dangerous terrorists of modern times. He'd go underground, lie low, and in a month everything would start again, but in another place with other perpetrators. And then other children would die, other families would be destroyed, and Karim would continue to spin his bloody web around the world. James looked at his daughter's photograph and his hands clenched into fists. He had to choose. Either save his marriage now, prevent his wife from committing the irreparable, protect her from the fate of being a terrorist's lover, or let this continue. Watch as Rachel sink deeper and deeper into the whirlpool of forbidden passion, knowing that every step she took brought her closer to the abyss. Endure their meetings, their touches, maybe even their intimacy. And all this time knowing that on the day of the school field trip, his own Sophia might be among the victims. But if he could hold on, if he could find the strength to go through this hell, he could catch the whole group, stop the terror once and for all. Rachel was a pawn in this game, but she was still his wife. His Sophia believed in him implicitly, considered him her hero. And heroes don't have the luxury of making mistakes, even if the price of the right decision is your own heart. At night, James didn't sleep a wink. Sitting in his home office, he meticulously developed an operation plan, for the first time in his life praying to God that his professional intuition wouldn't let him down. The plan was daring and dangerous, but the only possible one. He knew the shopping mall's layout like the back of his hand, knew every nook and cranny, every utility room. Calculations showed that there was a way to lock Rashid in one of the utility rooms when he came to plant the explosives. A room with thick concrete walls, capable of containing an explosion. And the capture team could be stationed in the parking lot, where, according to his observations, the gang gathered for the final preparations. The main thing was to calculate everything down to the minute, to leave them no chance of retreat. After finishing the plan, he took out a bottle of whiskey, but didn't drink it. Instead, he looked at Rachel sleeping in the next room, listening to her even breathing. He'd have to live with this torture for a few more days, see his wife going to secret meetings with Rashid, pretend not to notice the smell of someone else's cologne on her clothes, endure her distancing gaze at breakfast. Every step she took towards Rashid would be a step towards the success of the operation. Every kiss she shared with the terrorist would be a brick in the building of a trap for his group. "I'm sorry, darling," he whispered into the darkness, "but I have to let you fall to save thousands of others." His decision was made. He'd keep quiet about the affair until the very end, no matter what it cost his heart. James devoted the next 3 days to meticulously preparing the operation. He knew he couldn't afford to make a mistake. A detailed diagram of the shopping mall appeared in his office, with red dots marking positions for snipers, yellow marking the terrorist escape routes, and blue marking the locations of the capture teams. Every morning he walked through these points, calculating seconds, estimating angles of fire, checking dead zones of the surveillance cameras. At night, he reviewed camera footage, tracking the movements of Rashid's group, their habits, their weaknesses. His desk had turned into an operations center, where every detail of the upcoming operation was verified down to the millimeter. And the hardest thing was finding people he could trust. Out of the entire shopping mall security service, he chose only 3: Mike Donovan, a former Navy SEAL, Steve Ramirez, who'd served in Iraq, and Tom Baker, who'd served with him in the anti-terrorism unit. The conversation with each of them was short and brutally honest. "There's a job, dangerous, pay is standard. We could die." All 3 agreed without hesitation. Such people understand each other without words. James told them the details of the operation, omitting only one thing: his wife's role in this whole story. That was his personal burden, his personal hell to go through. There was less than a week left until D-Day, and every heartbeat counted down to the moment when he'd have to put everything on the line: his family, his love, his daughter's life, and the fate of hundreds of innocent people. Chapter 3: The Eve. The morning of the 15th was cold and overcast, as if nature itself foreshadowed the impending storm. James arrived at the shopping mall 3 hours before it opened. In the pre-dawn twilight, the building looked like a ghost, a silent witness to the drama to come. He was checking the readiness of his small army one last time. Mike took up position on the roof, from where he had a clear view of the entire parking lot. Steve blended in with the civilians, ready to block the main entrance at any moment. Tom coordinated the actions of the others from a utility room that had been transformed into a makeshift command post. The deployment of people was like setting up pieces in a chess game, where every wrong move could cost lives. James personally checked every radio, every control panel for the security systems. Bulletproof vests were hidden in the lockers of the technical staff. Weapons were disguised as tools. Evacuation exits were checked 3 times. Every camera was set to record. In his pocket was the triggering mechanism for the door locking system. One press, and any room in the center would turn into an airtight trap. All that was left was to wait for Rashid to make his first move. By 9 o'clock, the shopping mall was filled with the usual hum of voices. James methodically checked the security systems, trying not to miss a single detail. He personally walked around all the posts, checking the readiness of the cameras and motion sensors. An unusual silence reigned in the video surveillance room. He'd sent all the operators, including Rachel, to an unscheduled training session in another building. Only vetted people were to remain in place on this crucial day. Familiar images flickered on the monitors. Visitors at the storefronts, cashiers behind the counters, cleaners with carts. Everything as usual, if you didn't know that somewhere among this everyday bustle lurked death. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to movement on one of the screens. Rashid's familiar figure slipped into a utility corridor. James tensed up, his hand reaching for the radio, but then relaxed too early. It was just a reconnaissance. At that moment, the door to his office opened. Rachel stood in the doorway, pale and determined, like someone ready to jump off a cliff. She nervously fidgeted with some papers in her hands. "We need to talk, James." Her voice trembled, but there was firmness in it. He knew that tone, the way people speak when they've rehearsed their speech many times in front of the mirror. "I'm filing for divorce." 3 words, simple and terrible, like a shot at point-blank range. James looked at her, at the woman he'd loved for the past 5 years, and saw how desperately she was trying to keep her composure. Her fingers, still fidgeting with the papers, were trembling. "I love someone else, James, and I'm pregnant with his child." These words should have hit him like a hammer, broken his heart, made him scream with pain and rage. But he looked at the monitor screens, where Rashid's team was starting to take positions, and felt only tiredness. His wife, unaware that her beloved was planning a mass murder, was waiting for a reaction, ready for a scandal, for accusations, for anything but what followed. "Rachel," he said calmly, almost gently, "I'm very busy right now. There's a serious security threat at the center. Can we discuss this later?" He saw the confusion on her face turn to resentment. She'd expected drama, tears, maybe even a plea to stay. But her husband, who just learned about the affair and pregnancy with another man, was simply putting off this conversation, like an unimportant meeting on the calendar. It was the last straw. Rachel turned around and ran out of the office, slamming the door. James watched her go on the monitor. Tom's voice crackled in the earpiece. "Boss, they've started moving." The clock was ticking. The news of his wife's pregnancy was still ringing in James's ears when the first signals came from the observers. His still legal wife was pregnant by a terrorist. That thought burned in his mind like a branding iron. But now he couldn't let his personal drama take over. A much more terrible story was unfolding on the monitors. "A group of 3 entered through the service entrance," Mike reported. "2 are moving towards the central atrium," Steve confirmed. "Van in position at the west entrance," Tom's voice whispered in the earpiece. James turned on the general frequency. "Attention all units, it started." His fingers flew across the keyboard, activating pre-prepared security protocols. Somewhere there, among the ordinary visitors to the shopping mall, his daughter Sophia and her class were listening to the tour guide, unaware that if her father made a mistake, she would die. "Boss, Rashid is moving towards the technical floor." Mike's voice was strained. "I see him. He's got a backpack." James clenched his fists. Everything was going exactly according to plan. The terrorists had fanned out to pre-designated points, preparing for a synchronized strike. But they didn't know that every step they took was calculated, every movement was tracked, every meter of their path led to a trap. "Capture team in the parking lot is ready," Tom reported. "Snipers in position," Steve confirmed. James displayed a diagram of the building on the central monitor, where red dots, the terrorists, were slowly crawling to their intended positions. Blue dots, his people, were ready to act. Everything had to happen simultaneously. Rashid being locked in the technical room, the support group in the atrium being captured, and the van in the parking lot, where, according to his calculations, Karim was located, being surrounded. There was no room for error. Any inaccuracy could lead to disaster. "Rashid is in place," the radio hissed. On the screen, he could see him taking some device out of his backpack. "All teams, code red. Let's start the operation." James pressed the button to lock the doors to the technical floor. The trap snapped shut. Massive fire doors slammed shut, cutting Rashid off from the rest of the world. James saw on the monitor how he twitched at the unexpected sound, how his hands froze over the open backpack. In the next second, the terrorist darted to the door, yanking the handle. Too late. The thick steel doors, capable of withstanding a direct blast, had locked the exit tight. Rashid was locked in the concrete box of the technical room, like in a bunker. "Mike, are your people ready?" James spoke into the radio calmly, although his heart was pounding like crazy. "Capture team at the doors, waiting for the signal," the former Navy SEAL responded. On another monitor, the second part of the operation was unfolding. 3 security service vans were slowly surrounding the terrorists' minibus in the parking lot. Inside, James knew for sure, was Karim, the mastermind of the entire operation. the man the whole world thought was dead. Steve, report on the atrium. Two in sight, armed, but weapons are hidden under their clothes, waiting for a signal from Rashid. James smiled. They were indeed waiting for a signal that would never come. Rashid was locked in a room with walls a meter thick, capable of containing any explosion. Even if he decided to detonate the explosives, only he would be hurt. All teams begin the capture, working simultaneously. James turned on the general evacuation siren. The piercing wail filled the shopping mall, causing visitors to rush to the exits in a panic. In this commotion, no one noticed as men in security uniforms swiftly twisted the arms of two men in the atrium. In the parking lot, the capture team was already storming the van where Karim was hiding. "Boss," Tom's alarmed voice suddenly rang out. "We have a problem, Rashid. He's demanding negotiations. Says he'll blow himself up if the head of security doesn't talk to him personally." James froze. He'd foreseen this turn of events but had hoped it wouldn't come to this. "Tom, what's the situation in the parking lot?" "Karim is taken, the others too. All clear." James looked at the monitor where Rashid was packing his concrete prison. Well, it was time for the last act of this drama. "Mike, is the bomb disposal suit at the entrance to the technical compartment?" "Yes, boss, as agreed." "Good. I'm going to negotiate." "James, this is suicide." Tom's voice in the earpiece sounded alarmed. "He's cornered. He has explosives. He knows his brother has been caught. He has nothing to lose." Mike and Steve also spoke out against it, with the short, clipped phrases of professionals who had seen such negotiations end in tragedy too many times. But James had already made his decision. He had to meet Rashid face to face, not just for the sake of the operation, for his own sake. For all those sleepless nights, when he'd watched this man destroy his family. Donning the bomb disposal suit was like an ancient ritual. Every clasp, every carabiner, every element of protection was checked with methodical thoroughness. The heavy helmet with the visor, the massive bulletproof vest, special pads on the joints, all this was supposed to protect him from the blast wave if Rashid did decide to self-detonate. "Check the connection." Tom personally checked the operation of the radio built into the helmet. "Don't do anything stupid, boss. You have a daughter." "Sophia." James closed his eyes for a moment, remembering her smile this morning when she left for the field trip. She should have already been evacuated with the other visitors. His little girl who believed that Dad always knew how to do the right thing, who considered him a hero. "Tom, if something goes wrong." He didn't finish the sentence, but his deputy understood. "I'll take care of your girls, both of them." The massive door to the technical room slowly rose. James stepped inside and it immediately dropped behind him. In the dim light of the emergency lamps, he saw Rashid. He was standing by the far wall, holding some device with wires sticking out of it. His face, usually so affable and friendly, now resembled a frozen mask. "I'm here." James's voice, distorted by the helmet speaker, sounded unrecognizable. "Let's talk." Chapter 4, Resolution. The concrete box of the technical room seemed to James like a coffin in which the fate of their confrontation was to be decided. The dim emergency lights cast sinister shadows on the walls, and the hollow echo of the ventilation reminded him of a distant funeral bell. Through the thick glass of the helmet, he carefully studied the man opposite him, the one who had destroyed his family and planned to take dozens of innocent lives. "You know, James," Rashid said calmly, almost in a friendly tone as if they were meeting over a cup of coffee, not in a mind room, "I suspected you were on to something. You've been watching me way too closely lately. But I'll be honest, I didn't think you'd let me get so far with Rachel." His fingers absent-mindedly stroked the wires of the explosive device, and that gesture made James shudder inwardly. "It must have been painful to watch your wife fall in love with someone else," Rashid continued, taking a step forward. "To see our meetings, read our messages, know about every date, and yet you endured it. Why? Oh yes, of course, you were waiting for my brother, Karim." He smirked, but there wasn't a hint of fun in that smirk. James was silent, realizing that Rashid would now speak his mind, spilling out everything that had accumulated. That was part of his plan, to let the terrorists speak, to let him feel his superiority. Time was on their side. Every minute of conversation was a minute when the explosives remained unactivated. Do you know what's most humiliating for you, James? You saw everything, every step I took, every touch I made to your wife. How I hugged her in the hallways, how I kissed her in the technical rooms, how I whispered compliments in her ear. You, the former commander of the anti-terrorism unit, sat and watched as some jerk took your woman. And you did nothing. Nothing, and what are you after that? Can you even call yourself a man? Rashid laughed, and his laughter echoed off the concrete walls. Do you think you won? Caught the terrorists, prevented the terrorist attack, saved innocent lives? Maybe, but at what cost, James? I've already won. I've destroyed your family. Your wife is carrying my child, and you can't change that. Every time you look at that baby, you'll remember your powerlessness, your shame. How you cowardly hid behind the monitors while I made her mine, James. And you did nothing to prevent it. James felt his hands involuntarily clench into fists inside the protective gloves of the bomb disposal suit. Every word Rashid said hit the mark, tearing open old wounds. Because there was truth in his words, a monstrous, painful truth that he'd have to live with for the rest of his days. You've lost the most important thing, your male honor. Rashid slowly raised his hand with the detonator. And you know what? Even if I blow us both up now, it won't change anything. Your wife already belongs to me. My child will grow up knowing that his real father was a warrior, not a coward hiding behind cameras. You can kill me, James, but you'll never be able to erase the fact that I took your wife while you watched helplessly. That brand will stay with you forever. Rashid's finger rested on the detonator button. You know what's the funniest thing? I'm even grateful to you. Your weakness made my mission much easier. Goodbye, hero. In his voice was the triumphant mockery of a man who knew he'd already inflicted a wound on his enemy that would never heal. Time seemed to stand still. James saw Rashid's finger begin to press the button, saw his face contort into a triumphant grimace. In the earpiece of the bomb disposal suit, Tom's alarmed voice rang out. "Boss, the sensors show activation. Get out of there." But James stood his ground. You know, Rashid, his voice through the helmet speaker sounded mechanically calm. You're right. I really did let you destroy my family, watched you seduce my wife, endured your touches to her, your kisses, your looks. And yes, it was humiliating, painful, but you know what else? It was worth it. Because now your brother, that invincible Karim, is sitting in handcuffs. Your terrorist network is destroyed. And you're just a pawn I used to get to him. Rashid's face contorted with rage. You're lying. My brother is doing what we planned upstairs while I'm locked up here, and you're just a weakling who... He didn't finish. His thumb pressed the button all the way down. The explosion was deafening. In the confined space of the technical room, the blast wave, unable to find an exit, ricocheted off the walls like an enraged beast. James was thrown to the door with such force that, had he not been wearing the bomb disposal suit, his bones would have turned to dust. The world around him turned into a fiery hell. Scorching air tried to break through under the protective mask. Heat seeped through even the special fabric of the suit. The ringing in his ears was so loud that James didn't immediately hear the cries in the earpiece. Tom, Mike, Steve, they were all shouting at once, demanding an answer. He tried to move. His body obeyed with difficulty, but the suit held up. Held up, damn it. Through the fogged-up visor of the helmet, he saw the concrete dust settling, saw the last flames dying out. There was nothing left of Rashid. He'd stood at the epicenter of the explosion, turning into part of the destructive force he himself had spawned. "I'm alive," James croaked into the microphone, struggling to his feet. "Repeat, I'm alive, target neutralized." Every movement was accompanied by pain throughout his body, but it was the pain of life, not death. The heavy door to the technical room slowly crawled up, letting in the capture team. Someone was helping him walk, someone was supporting him by the arms. And he was thinking only of one thing: it was over. It hadn't ended the way he'd wanted it to, but it had ended the way it should have ended. The next 48 hours blurred into one endless interrogation for James. In a small room of the federal building, smelling of coffee and cigarettes, He told again and again how he'd tracked down the terrorist group, how he'd collected evidence, how he'd planned the operation. Across from him sat grim people in austere suits, recording every word. And behind the thin glass of the interrogation room, he saw other agents bent over monitors. They were reviewing surveillance camera footage, studying documents found on the terrorists. Karim al-Khazri, the presumed dead leader of the terrorist cell, was sitting in the next room. He was silent stubbornly with a fanatical gleam in his eyes, but his silence didn't change anything anymore. On the hard drive in the van, they found complete information about the terrorist network: safe houses, passwords, names of contacts. "You dealt them a serious blow," said the gray-haired agent, handing James a glass of water. "Maybe the most serious in the last 5 years." The award ceremony was held without unnecessary pomp, quietly, almost familiarly. Only those who were in the know gathered in a small conference room of the city administration: representatives of the special services, city authorities, journalists from trusted publications. James stood on a small podium, leaning on a cane. The effects of the explosion were still making themselves felt. The medal for distinguished service glittered on his lapel, and in his pocket was a notice of promotion. He was offered to head the anti-terrorism unit in the private sector. "Thanks to exceptional professionalism and personal courage," the mayor's voice sounded, "the largest terrorist attack on the territory of our city was prevented. Dozens, if not hundreds, of lives were saved." James listened to these words and they seemed empty to him. Yes, he had done his duty. Yes, he had saved people. But the price of that success was written in his medical record: 3 broken ribs, a concussion, multiple bruises. And those were only the physical wounds. The emotional ones, they were much deeper. In the front row sat Sophia, his daughter, looking at her father with eyes shining with pride. She didn't know the whole truth and never would. For her, he'd remain a hero who saved hundreds of people, not a man who let a terrorist destroy his family to catch a bigger target. Next to her was an empty seat, a seat where Rachel should have been sitting, but she wasn't there, and never would be again. After the ceremony, James was back in the hospital. The doctors insisted on an additional examination. The white walls of the ward pressed down on him, reminding him of the concrete box where he'd met death face to face. Sophia came every day after school, sat on the edge of the hospital bed, and told him about her lessons, her friends, about how her classmates admired her hero father. At such moments, his heart clenched with pain and love at the same time. "Dad," she said one day, fidgeting with the edge of the hospital blanket, "why doesn't Rachel come anymore? She hasn't left us, has she?" Her voice held the same uncertainty as many years ago when she'd asked about her own mother. James looked into those sincere eyes and realized he had to protect her from the bitter truth, just as he had protected her from the explosion in the shopping mall. "No, honey," he gently took her hand. "It's just that sometimes adults can't be together even if they once loved each other. Rachel, she needs time to figure things out. She's gone to stay with her mother." He didn't mention the child Rachel was carrying, that she had decided to keep that child no matter what, that somewhere a boy or girl would grow up whose father had died as a terrorist but whose mother would never tell them about it. That same evening he received a letter from Rachel. The handwriting was uneven, hurried, as if she was afraid she'd change her mind. "I can't stay, James, not after everything that's happened. You let me fall in love with a monster knowing who he was. I understand why you did it. Maybe someday I'll even be able to forgive you, but to live with it, with the realization that my child was conceived as part of a special operation. I'm going to stay with my mother in Oregon. Don't look for us. Goodbye." James sat for a long time, looking out the window of the hospital room. Beyond the glass, the sunset was burning out, painting the sky in the colors of fire, the same fire in which his former life had burned down. He'd saved hundreds of people, prevented a terrorist attack, become a hero. But the price of that heroism had turned out to be unbearably high. Or maybe, on the contrary, it was a cleansing flame that cleared away all the extraneous things in his life. Time will tell. If you enjoyed this story, give the author a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and share your emotions in the comments. Thanks.